Welcome on behalf of Women's Tech Forum. Thank you for joining us. I'm Elena Winters. By day, I work at Facebook, and I'm one of the co-founders of WTF. Before we get started with today's session, I wanted to thank all of our sponsors and community members for adjusting with us in 2020 as we moved to virtual-based gatherings. Last year, we brought 8 unique masterclasses to you, hosted by an incredible and inspiring group of women, all experts in their fields, who taught us everything from understanding the art of negotiation, how to create successful D&I programs, all the way to how to understand investment methodologies and how that differs with women. We're almost 1 year into this now, and in 2021, Women's Tech Forum wants to continue to be there for you. Throughout this year, you'll see more masterclasses with fresh topics, more engagement on our social media platforms in the form of blogs, recommended books to check out, and known career opportunities across our industry. With that, we encourage all of you to help participate in those efforts in hopes that we can connect more women to opportunities and information. We're so lucky to have the amazing women from the Him for Her organization speaking with us today about becoming board ready. From private to public boards to nonprofit, there's a lot to demystify here, and these experts have all had extensive experience and are here to share their stories and guide us through the unknowns and how to best prepare for board positions at our respective career positions. Like in previous sessions, there's a Q&A button on the right side of the platform. Also, the event chat is live, so feel free to drop comments. This will be a discussion style today, so no slides. I would recommend everyone to use the content slider at the bottom of your blue jeans or at the bottom of your screen to maximize the video for a best experience and engagement today. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Him for Her CEO and founder, Jocelyn Mangan, who we are thrilled to host today. Jocelyn, over to you.
Good morning or good afternoon to everybody, and I'm thrilled to be here today and joined by our amazing panelists. Thank you to the organization for bringing us here and for dedicating a whole hour to what is an incredible topic of demystifying the boardroom. So I am the CEO and founder of Him for Her. And I founded this organization because I saw a unique opportunity to accelerate the pace of change in the boardroom as it relates to diversity. As we all may or may not know, there is quite an opportunity. Today, as we sit here, only 1 in 5 public company board members is a woman. And when you get to the private company space, it's even worse. We did a study of the most highly funded venture-backed private companies and found that 60% of those boards are still all male. And the reason's pretty straightforward. People tend to look for board members in their personal networks. And while that's not in and of itself a bad thing, the challenge is just the networks aren't that diverse. So Him for Her exists truly to close what we call the network gap. And we do that by extending networks and by building referrals of candidates for board openings. And we do our work for free. We're a nonprofit. The goal of the session today is really focused on the path to the boardroom. And I think we have an incredible audience of talented operators and technologists and perhaps even some board members in the audience. So we're going to cover a wide range of topics. And what we want to cover is not only the path to the boardroom, but also how to approach your first year as a board member. We have an amazing panel representing different areas of expertise and board backgrounds. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with Anne and Michele. I'd love to welcome you both, Anne and Michele, and have you do a brief introduction of yourself. And if you would, and Anne, we'll start with you. Please just give, briefly your background as it relates to cloud and networking and infrastructure, which is a big passion of this group that we're speaking with today, as well as the boards that you sit on, which is an impressive list. And then finally, just it's fun to know, why did you say yes to your most recent board seat?
Thank you, Jocelyn. And it's just really great to be here with everyone. And I just love this topic because it wasn't that long ago I was in the seat wondering what is the path to the boardroom. So it's great to be able to give back and to share some of the lessons learned. I've had a 30-year career in high tech, largely customer facing in solution engineering. I also was able to lead a global go-to-market specialized sales organization, and my final operating role, I led a platform product organization, a $2.5 billion business for Salesforce. It was really in this role that I interacted a lot more with CEOs of startup companies. And I realized that this 30-year experience that I had was really helpful in advising CEOs. And it's there that I made the decision to really pursue boards. I was looking for companies that were B2B, that were platform technologies. I'll call them boring technologies because this is the stuff I love as a math major and computer science person, but that companies could not do without. And so those were the companies I was looking for, great brands, but also companies that were in transformation. So they were looking to transform their customer engagement, and that the CEOs and the boards had the appetite to really take that on. So that's what I was looking for. I'm currently on 5 boards, 3 public boards and 2 private. And at all of them have that combination in the interview process that really made me feel like I had a unique voice to bring to the table, that I could bring value, and that they were in a place where my experience would really help grow the company, represent the shareholders and the key stakeholders, the customers, the partners, the employees at these great companies. So great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Anne. And Michele, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit, answer these same questions, which is your background in cloud networking and infrastructure, as well as the boards you sit on and why you joined your most recent board.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Nan. My entire career has been in technology. I started off as a hardware engineer at a company called Sun Microsystems in the 90s. And I spent about 6 years there designing boards in their workstation product group. I then moved into venture capital at a firm called Greylock Partners, and I spent about 8 years there. I would say that that's probably my first experience with the board of directors. Since Greylock would make investments in companies, we would always take a board seat, and that was really my first exposure to startups, but also what the role of a board member is. And I would like to say that I feel like I learned from the best from the partners at the firm on the different roles a board member can play in a private company. From there, I moved on to the operating side at 2 companies. The first company was a cloud security company where I joined when there was about 15 people, and I led the pivot into enterprise security for them. And the second role was I ran all revenue for a digital health company called Flight Health and helped take them public there, as well as I owned all of marketing through customer success. And there, in both of those companies, I really found it a great experience to be on the opposite side of the table of the board of directors as an operator. And so knowing from an investor standpoint what they were looking for, I felt like that gave me a great perspective as an executive operating in a company on how they thought, what they were looking for, and honestly how to present to them. I now spend my time, I'm an independent director on 2 boards. I'm an advisor and operating consultant for a number of companies. And I would say that when I look at board opportunities, I look for opportunities where I'm very excited about the opportunity they have. I look at mostly private boards. So are they looking, does their product resonate with me? Do I see the opportunity that they're going after? Do I get along with the CEO and founder? And a private board, it's a little bit different. You work very closely with the founding team and the executive team to help build the company. And those relationships are really important to me, as well as the other board members around the table. So that's what I look for. My focus is really mostly on the private side and taking the experience that I had from both investing as well as growing and scaling private companies and helping now CEOs and founders do the same with theirs.
Great. Thank you, Michele and Anne. I think you guys can tell in the audience we've got some great experience. So let's dive in. And we're going to start with the very basic question of what signals board readiness? What experiences, what attributes? And Anne, why don't we start with you on this one?
Sure. I really think, as you can tell from Michele and my story, that, board readiness is the story of your career. So it's the operating roles that you've been in. I have found that where the greatest value that I bring in the boardroom is actually the hard times that I went through whether I was working at IBM or Oracle or at Salesforce. You go through an operating role in leadership. You go through tough seasons and you learn a lot of the lessons. And these are the things that you can bring to the boardroom. So I would say that it's the lessons that you learn in the day-to-day. When you're in those jobs, you may not feel like you're really learning a lot, but when you look back, those are the stories and the convictions that you bring to the boardroom table. Just in addition to that, I did go to the Stanford board school college, and just learning about governance and some of the things that are important in public boards as well as private boards. Is also interesting and a great sort of way to be learning and picking up that information as you go along.
Great. Michele, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with what Anne said. I think a lot of it is what experiences can you bring to the company and to the board. Our jobs are basically to help the company make the optimal decisions, and especially in tough times, that's harder. And so having that experience and having that empathy for the operating team is really important, and bringing your perspective on, situations that you've been in the past, and what's gone well, what's not gone well, and maybe how you would have done it differently gives a great perspective to the CEO.
Great. And I think another basic question that's often comes up is really, what are boards looking for? And to answer that, let's even talk a little bit about what is the board's job and their responsibilities. And I think what's great is you both have private and public company board service under your belt. So Michele, why don't we start with you on this one?
Sure. So, I think for me, the job of a board director, it's multi-pronged, right? You have governance, and as an independent director, you're really looking out for the interests of the common shareholders, as well as the employees and the customers. And so, the decisions that are made in the boardroom, you have that hat on of, you're looking after the best interests of those stakeholders. The second, the second prong is really, you're there to basically help the company make the right decisions, or the best decisions that they can in critical junctures in the company. And it's important that, you can provide not only your perspective, but that you help provide a framework and you ask questions. It's not your job to make the decision. It's your job to help them get to the optimal decision there. And then there's a bunch of administrative, responsibilities of approvals and stuff that, are fairly routine. But the first two I really think are what I prioritize and what I think the job is.
Great. And anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with Michele. I think in addition, the thing that I find very interesting in the private boards is that a lot of the board members are investors. And the CEO is really the only representative of the company, and thinking of the employees in a way that's not an investor's lens. And as an independent board member on a private company, I find really working with the CEO, understanding as an operator, his perspective or her perspective on where they're taking the company adds a very unique voice to the board, in especially in private companies. But in the public companies, I think the greatest value is making sure that your voice is unique. There's only 8 to 10 people around the table. And so when they're looking for you to join a board, they are really looking for your unique voice. And so that can be, for me, a lot of it is a customer perspective, a customer-centric lens, go-to-market lens, as well as product. I'm very interested in product. But whether you're in HR or, it doesn't just have to be finance, there really are different perspectives that help a company scale if you understand people and the people aspect of things. So I think it's more that your voice is unique, your convictions and point of view, and you bring that to the table.
That's a great point. I also want to just stop and thank the audience for sending in questions ahead of the session and the questions that are coming in now. This next question was sent in ahead, but I think it relates to some of the ones in chat, which is, do the most successful board positions tightly couple with your professional experience? And while you ponder on that, I'm just going to add a little bit from the chat. One of the questions was kind of the minimum number of years of career experience, and I think, thinking all the way company stage of seed to Fortune 50, so that's a good thing to filter into this question. And the other one was asking kind of, do board appointments tie very closely to your current operating role? So really the broader question that I'd love for you guys to speak to is, how do you think about the relationship between your current operational role and those board positions in terms of both success and opportunity? And as you think about breadth of experience, how do you think about that? So Michele, let's start with you on that one.
Sure. So for me, they're pretty closely coupled, either based on the industries that I've worked in, and so my knowledge of the industries and my contacts there, or my role. And so usually when people contact me, it's about either the cloud software space, the security space, or they're looking for someone with a go-to-market lens to help them with that perspective. And so I would say, in my experience, people are looking for specific traits of a board member where they can be additive to the conversation around the table. In terms of the minimum number of years, I don't know if I could give you a minimum number of years. I think it really is just based on the experience and the journey that you've gone through in your career, and where you've been, and what you've seen and what you've done. And it could be it could be long. It was 10 plus years for me, if not 15 plus years, before I took my first official board as an independent board member. But I think depending on your role and the role you play in the company, and your experiences, you may be board ready sooner than that. And so I don't think it's the number. I think it's the quality and the context of your experiences.
Great, thank you, Michele. Anne?
Yeah, I would heartily agree with Michele that our convictions are born from our experience. And so I do think that where you spent your career or your professional time, your investments, sort of builds the conviction of your point of view. And so I do think it ties very directly to what you're doing, whether you're in product or in HR or in go-to-market or finance. You certainly, it forms your opinions. And so I think it is really important. And I agree with Michele as well. The smallest company I ever worked for as an operator was Salesforce. So it's a very different lens to be working in a very large company to a smaller. Sometimes in a startup, you see all the roles, the board members. It's just a different environment. And so it's a concentrated experience. So to Michelle's point, I don't know that there's a real number you could put on it to say that you need so many years of experience. But I think you would gauge it just as you would if you went for any job role. You would think, do I have the experience that could take on the tough situations or complexities that this new role is bringing to me?
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just build on that with a story. I have an 8 and a 10-year-old. And when I started this company, they asked me, what's a board member? And I had to think about how to describe it to their mentality. And I said, well, it's the boss of the boss. So another way to think about it is, do you have enough experience to guide a CEO? And that looks really different if that's a seed stage company or if that's a Fortune 50 company. And the only other thing I'd say is when you think about your own experience, it's helpful to think about it on 5 dimensions of expertise. So that you don't narrow yourself too much. So as you think about your own expertise, functional, which is a lot of the similarities that bring us here today, industry, business model, right? So sometimes people will say, we're looking for a marketplace business expert, for example. Customer segment. Sometimes people will say we want someone who really understands the millennial buyer, for example. And then scaling, which means a growth trajectory. So have you seen a company from X to Y revenue or been through an IPO? So I would encourage everyone in the audience to also think about yourself and your experience across multiple dimensions. Well, let's move into the types of boards. So one of the questions, and we referenced this a little bit, is like, what is the difference between a nonprofit board, a private company board, and a public company board? Anne, I'd like to start with you on this one.
So I'll speak very lightly about the nonprofit because it's not where I have a lot of experience, but there was a season of my life where I stayed home to raise my 2 children. And during that time, I was on a nonprofit board because I had conviction about our local library. So I was on the library board, and that is my experience. And so from that, I would just say, and in hindsight, looking back, I would join a nonprofit board if it's meaningful to you. You know, if you have a sense that it matters to you. You'll probably meet people on that board that have similar convictions. And so that's why I think nonprofits are important. The biggest difference I would say between private and public is, Jocelyn has brought this up, as has Michele. In private boards, you really have a close relationship with the CEO, and you're in a much more of an advisory role. And hopefully the company is growing, a high growth company. And so that's the dynamic. There's governance. It's just not to the extent of a public board's governance. And but frankly, there's a lot of the same decisions. And a public board, you are advising the CEO, of course. You're representing the shareholders. You have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. Governance plays a bigger role. But I would say that the relationship with the CEO and other board members, frankly, in my experience, is material in both of them. So I've enjoyed very much both sides of this.
Thank you. And Michele, if you would build on that, we had a few other questions, just, if you had thoughts on how you leverage that nonprofit board experience to get to the for-profit, and also just about the financials of the nonprofit boards. Do they ask you to make a fundraising commitment or an investment? Anything to add to those questions?
Yeah, I would say that I don't have a base to speak to on the nonprofit side, since I've never served on a nonprofit board. I would echo all of Anne's comments around, making sure that you had conviction for their mission. I think that's very important. And, for me, I think, the biggest difference between private and public is, the public, once you're a public company, there's a lot more, I would say, administrative things that you need to make sure that you comply with. And so you have a number of committees that you need to make sure that they're structured properly. Where on a private board, you have it's a lot less formal. You still have some of the governance, but because you're private, you don't have the formality of many of the public company requirements.
Yeah, well said. Let's talk about how to get your board seat. So I love asking this question. Thanks for this question in chat. Why don't you each answer, how did you get your first board seat? And we'll go from there. Anne, why don't you start?
I think you mentioned it right at the start, Jocelyn. It's a lot of it is networking. And I would say the biggest change for me was just saying yes. Sometimes when you're working in a big role, you don't have time to breathe and just trying to do your job and have some sort of personal life, you say no to a lot of things. And I think it was when I decided to start saying yes. I joined Advancing Women Executives. I joined Women in the Boardroom just to sort of be in the right circles to hear what these organizations and Him for Her that are focusing on really helping prepare if this is what you want to do as a chapter in your career. But for me, just the way that I worked, I was very much a heads down sort of operator. And so I just started to say yes to invitations, to being part, like a limited partner in a venture fund, to invitations to dinners, to a Him for Her event, and just started to meet, and it went from there. You can't really describe the trajectory of who you meet, who knows somebody, who has an opening. I do think, sort of LinkedIn and bio, it's really table stakes. If you Google your name right now, the first thing that comes up is LinkedIn. So of course you want it to look nice. But I think that just starts to enhance the network. For me, it was a lot of just saying, yes, I'm willing, and meeting people and talking to them, and then taking the opportunities as they came.
That's great. Thank you, Anne. Michele, how'd you get your first board seat?
It was a very similar story. I mean, I think, in my world with my background, I knew a lot of investors, and I had let them know that I was leaving my full-time operating job and I was looking to still give back and contribute, and that I would be open to these positions. And, it was basically through my network of someone who I knew, introduced me to the company. And I worked with them for some time before I joined the board, as a get to know you on both sides, and so that I could understand the business and where I can contribute. But I think, most board seats, there's two ways that generally you can obtain them. One is, I think through the network, either someone who knows that there's an opening, as Anne said. A lot of times investors on the private side will help a company through their own network, so it's good to be connected there. And the other opportunities, I found that there are recruiters who are recruiting for board seats, both private and public. And being in their network is always helpful, because when they get chartered by either a venture firm or the company to find an independent board member, you want to be in their Rolodex, and you want to be considered based on the criteria that they're looking for.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just build on that, something I think about pretty much 120% of the time. The thing that's interesting about the board space is that there's opacity on both sides, and a lot of it tends to be housed in word-of-mouth networks. And what I mean by that is the people looking for board members often look in their personal networks, which we've talked about, need to be extended to include women and people of color. But on the flip side, those people who are interested in boards, those board openings are also held in word-of-mouth networks. They're not really posted on a web page anywhere. So tactically, what I often tell people who are board ready today is to do three things, which is one, to write down the names of all the board members, CEOs, and investors that you personally know. Two, to proactively reach out to them and express your interest in board service and what it is you bring to a board. And three, to ask them to keep you top of mind. So that's something to think about. We got a fun question in chat, which is, have you ever turned a board position down? Michele.
I actually have. And the reason why, it was around, I didn't feel comfortable with the business. It was not so much the people, but it was something I wasn't sure I felt passionate about. And, to me, I really need to connect with the company's mission. And so for me, it was just sort of a personal choice of, I really enjoyed meeting everybody, on the board and at the company, and I totally respected what they did. For me, it didn't resonate with me on the space that they were going after, and so I politely declined.
Thank you. Anne?
Yes, I think definitely a couple of times. One was for the same reason, Michele. Something did not resonate. And again, when you join a board, you're signing on for the tough times the company may go through. And so if you don't feel that either the other people on the board or the mission of the company that you could go through those tough times, it's really important to think about that. The other is just turning things down because, my plate was full. I will say on this point that one of the great things about the position that Michele and I are in is I immediately think about other people that I know and always ask, like, I'd love to give you a referral. And that is a way to begin to change the dynamic of the network.
That's such a great suggestion. Thanks for that, Anne. And that's a big piece of this, right, is time. I think it's probably one of the things we're all short on. So when you're thinking about the time it takes to be a board member, how should prospective board members think about the time commitment? Michele?
Yeah, and so, I would say that the time commitment is not as huge as if you're in a full-time operating role, but it's still substantial. So you need to think about it as, I think about it in two parts. One is the actual board meeting, which, it depends on the cadence. It can be quarterly, it could be every 2 months, and they're usually 2 to 3 hours. That's not the majority of the work, though. The majority of the work, I feel, is always done outside those board meetings, and it's meeting with the CEO, it's interviewing prospective executives to help them recruit. It's going through strategy with them. It's even going through their budgeting, offline with their CFO. And so, I think for me personally, it goes in sort of spikes. There's a lull, but then, planning comes, I get more involved. And so it can vary depending on the company and what you bring to the table. But I found, if I think about it quarterly, it's probably, 5 days a week if you sum it all up per quarter for me.
Yeah. And anything to add to that?
No, I think Michele really, really covered it, like especially when she said, it's not as much as an operator role, but it's significant investment.
Yeah, we had a panelist the other day who was talking about it. He said he thinks about it as like a breadcrumb every day. That there's like a little thing that he does every day for his board, whether it's read an article, an industry article, or answer an email. And I thought that was a really helpful way to think about it. So let's move to translating your operational superpowers to board superpowers, which is something that I think is really an important topic to discuss and demystify. So I'd love for you to speak about how one should think about translating your superpowers to board superpowers and what leads to success. Anne, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think on this question, it reminds me of the framework that you gave, Jocelyn. Like, I think about the operator superpowers that I have was scaling a company, being and understanding customer segmentation, always being like thinking about how from hardware to software to SaaS to product-led growth, those companies that I've been a part of, what that experience brings to the table. And I think they translate as you think about on a board where you're asked, to look at the CEO, to make sure that there's succession planning, to look at M&A, to look at, long-term strategy, performance metrics in comp committees, things like that. The operating experience that you have really comes to bear in a word that Michele used, an empathetic view of a company. And so I think that's really the operating superpowers that you bring to the boardroom.
Great. Michele?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with Anne. I mean, I think of it as, there's the functional knowledge from having done it before and helping to guide them, through that, whether it's scale or growth, to empathy, because, being a CEO is really hard. It's a very lonely job. And there's some tough decisions that he or she needs to make. And oftentimes they haven't seen, where they're going before. And so you can provide a lens of what that may look like for them, as well as, I always say, like, here's what I did. This was not the right decision. Let me tell you why. And give them just a perspective on their options of like, don't make the same mistake that I did. It's your choice. You can do it, but like, here's what I've learned. And just helping them to get more clarity of what, the next chapter for them looks like.
Great. And we have a question in Q&A which relates to this, which is asking, can you be a board member and an operator at the same time? What would be great to him for her team is we just had an article shared this morning about the value of doing this. But clearly, I'd love for you guys to answer your perspective here. And
Yeah, I absolutely think that is hugely valuable. I mean, I wish I had the opportunity to do that. Some companies don't allow, operating executives to also sit on a board seat. But I think that having both is hugely valuable. It's valuable in the boardroom, and I think it's valuable for your experience to also ramp you into doing that if that's a chapter of your career that you want to do. So I would applaud any company to allow their executives to be able to do that. I don't know that you could do more than one board, but again, that's certainly up to each person's capacity. But I do think it's really important.
Yeah. Michele, anything to add, being an operator and a board member simultaneously?
I would say that it really, as Anne said, comes down to your own capacity. Depending on your role in the company, you may not even have a spare minute to do that. But if you do, I do encourage people to do so, because I just think it broadens their perspective, both in helping them think about what the board of directors cares about at their company, but also giving them perspective as a director for the company.
Great. Well, let's move into that boardroom. So as you've got your new board seat, it's your first year as a board member. How would you approach, or how should we think about approaching that first year as a new board member? Michele, let's start with you.
Sure. So my rule, what I always usually do is I spend more time listening than talking, because I'm trying to figure out if I'm not super familiar with the board and the company. I'm trying to figure out what the key issues are, how the board makes decisions, how I can contribute in a productive way, and what their interpersonal relationships on the board are like. And I personally just need to get grounding on that, before I feel like I can be productive. And so I spend a lot of time just listening, asking questions, and so just prodding on some things that I may not understand, and then developing those relationships. And those are, for me, usually, again, outside the board meeting, grabbing coffee routinely with the CEO, talking with the other board members, really just to get an understanding of where the board is, and how I can, contribute meaningfully.
Yeah, thank you. Anything to add to that, Anne?
Yeah, I love that Michele said she listened more than, sometimes we feel uncomfortable to just be quiet and listen and observe, but if that's your learning style, and it is mine too, it takes a lot of courage to sit and listen and observe. I found things that have been helpful to me in the first year, certainly with public companies, listening to earnings calls, really listening to the analyst questions and how the CEO and CFO answer them. It gets to the heart of a lot of the matter. And frankly, with this past, crazy year for all of us, it's been a great first year to be on a board, because at times of high change and flux, you come together in a way that has really developed the relationships between the board members and the CEO. While it's virtual, it's really brought a unity and a time of we are in this together to bring us through the changes that we have to take on. And so I never would have asked for it, but I do have to say it's made for a very interesting year one.
Yeah, I double down on that. I would also add one thing that I've learned is the importance of asking questions, and even within the questions, to ask what questions versus why questions. And I know that sounds like a tactical thing, but it's quite meaningful, and it's a tip that I share because it's been very helpful to me as a board member. So as you think about that first year, the flip side, are there any mistakes you made, something you may have done differently that you'd love to share with the audience? Michele?
I would say that mistakes, maybe providing commentary without really understanding the full context of the situation, which is sort of why I flip back to listening and asking questions. I think in the first year, it's so important to understand the dynamics in the boardroom, and really understand the relationships that, for private boards, the investors have with the CEO and the CEO has with the investors, and then, how you can be a bridge sometimes, between them.
Anne?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes to mind as you ask that question is really just, I think the only thing I would look back on and say is really asking, like you've both said, asking the questions and things that make you learn faster. So even if you're not on a committee, but you want to join another committee, just say, hey, reach out to the chair of that committee and say, I'd like to sit in as the listener. Is that okay? Can you invite me to the next? Just because I want to get a broader sense. Or talking to the CEO and saying, I'd really like to get to understand your go-to-market better. Are you okay? I'd like to meet with the CRO. I'd like to visit a facility. Like anything that sort of concentrates or speeds up your learning and your empathy for the company and what the employees are going through. Just make sure that you ask those questions. It's okay. And I think sometimes in the beginning, because a public board was a little less familiar to me, I wonder, is that okay? And I think that if I went back, I just would have done it right out of the gates.
And I echo that. I'm a new public board member, and those boards are larger typically, so 10 to 12 versus private boards maybe being 5 to 7. And I felt that I used my voice more on the private board than the public board. And if I were to do it again, I would ask more questions sooner. And I think that's just a good reminder. If you're sitting in that seat, you got there for a reason, and your voice is just as important as anyone else on that board. And there are no dumb questions, right? So great advice. And one thing I wanted to talk about, we talked a little bit about building relationships on the board, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper here, especially since we've all moved to Zoom, right? And so those kind of coffees and dinners have changed over the last year. How should you think about building rapport, not just with the board members, but also the CEO and also the operators in a company as a board member? Michele, why don't you start with this one?
Yeah, so, it takes proactive effort, right? And I always start with the CEO because he represents the common shareholders. He's sort of alone in that position, and I feel like I'm part coach, part therapist, part advisor, to him. And, my success as a board member is really, dependent on my relationship with them, the CEO, and my ability to earn his or her trust, as well as serve as that advisor, that special advisor to them. And so I spend a lot of time, meeting with the CEO. We pick topics to discuss that he or she is challenged with, and we can talk through that. I help them at times, with other board members around the table of, if there's expectations that are being placed on the CEO, helping him or her, figure out what that means and what the path, to be successful against those expectations are. And then for the other board members, it really is just about reaching out. And there's opportune times to talk about certain things after a board meeting where you can connect with them on certain topics that you'd love to just, discuss and maybe replay back what you've heard there. And I find that everyone is really open to that because I think everyone wants to have a productive board. But it does take some effort on your part to be proactive about making sure that you can connect with the others on the board, as well as, have those meaningful discussions.
Great. Anne, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, the one great thing about Zoom is the ability to jump on a meeting a little bit more easily than, flying around to all meet in person. And so, building relationship with the committee members, sometimes I find in committees, it's a smaller group. And so you really do get to develop that relationship. Again, anytime, macroeconomic or macro something going on creates a challenge where you're together more and you're spending more time with each other. But I do miss the in-person for the board-to-board relationships because sometimes just on the breaks in the meeting, you have those little sidebar conversations that I do miss that Zoom or virtual has a hard time bringing that about. And just to echo what Michele said, having standing meetings with the CEO or operators, managing operators in the company that you ask the CEO, is there anybody that you would like me to mentor or spend time with? And having those as standing meetings sort of takes the work out of it a little bit, whether that's once a quarter or once a month, depending, if it's a new person, sometimes a new CRO, I'll spend a little bit more time with. So those are ways to really build those relationships, even if you're on Zoom, which actually can be easier because no matter where you are, you can meet more easily.
That's a great suggestion. Well, let's talk about compensation. It is different when you're compensated on a board, and yet you are compensated on a board. We are not taking these roles out of the goodness of our hearts. And I think that this is a space that needs some demystification. So I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit about board compensation, how that pay might work, private versus public, negotiation, non-negotiation, how that works as it would compare to an operational role. When you're talking about compensation, I think is really important to understand. And why don't you start with this?
I'll cover the public board. I'm going to leave it to Michele to cover the private, since that is definitely her area of expertise. I would say, as you pursue public boards, Michele mentioned it, there are really some amazing recruiters out there. They are recruiting for public board seats. One of the first questions you can ask is just, what are the schedule of the board meetings? That matters, especially if you're on one board, you don't want conflicts. But it's also a matter of public record, what the compensation is for public board seats. So this is not negotiated. It is, equity and cash combination. And it varies slightly, but they're all around the same, and you can just look this up. This is public record on a proxy statement, and I'll leave the private board compensation to Michele.
Michele, thank you.
Yeah. So for private boards and for private companies, generally it's an equity compensation package. For a startup, cash is king, and so your service is really in return for the upside on the equity. And the percentage of equity can vary depending on the stage of the company. For a very early stage, you can expect more than if you're at the later stage. And that parallels you as an employee, when you join earlier versus later. The way I look at it is really the company's ultimate success is my success. And ideally, it translates into financial gain through the equity component.
Great. I want to get to this question. We have a lot of people in the audience who are interested maybe earlier in their career, not yet board ready. And I'd like to move to that group. What advice do you have for women early in their careers in general? Can women in tech pivot to this kind of board role or path? And if so, how? Let's start with Michele.
Yeah, so I definitely think, I think Anne and I are examples of that, where I would say early in my career, I never envisioned that this is where I would be or what I wanted to be. I think the most important thing to think about in your career is how you get there and the experiences that would lead you, to be qualified to be at the boardroom. And more importantly, give you that opportunity to be so, either via your network, your brand, your personal brand, or you're just known as someone who would contribute to, specific boards. I would look for opportunities where you're in a leadership role, or you can develop specific expertise. And then honestly, for, the private side, it's opportunities to be in the boardroom, right? Either as an operating exec, a presenter, or some other way, because I do think that exposure is really important, and just, knowing what goes on in the boardroom and seeing it for yourself, maybe not as a board director, but as an observer or presenter there.
Great, thank you, Michele. Anne?
Yes, I would say yes to everything that Michele said. Sometimes when you're in a job, even early in your career, you're really not thinking about a boardroom. So the only thing that I would, give advice to my younger self is just pay attention a little bit more. Think about the people who are watching you, working with you. And I think maybe what I would have done differently is just be more deliberate about learning about the things about the boardroom for your own company. What are the things that the board is discussing at the company that you're in? What is your CEO thinking about? Start to sort of build that way, because the work that you're doing is really the value that you will end up bringing to a boardroom. But I think making it less of a mystery might be, especially coming from an engineering and, math, I wasn't really thinking a lot about the business aspect of things, but yet they're really important. And it was important to every company I worked for. And so thinking about that, I think as I moved on in my career, really being part of some of the organizations that were focused on this, advancing women executive. I was part of Women in the Boardroom. They really just helped as those extra teaching materials that helped me start to formulate what would it look like and kind of take the mystery out of it.
Yeah, what a great point. I mean, you can't be what you can't see. And we have such a wide range on this call. We have people who can bring people into the boardroom early and people who can seek out the boardroom. So to double down on that point, if you are someone who gets to go to your own board meetings, maybe ask yourself at the next one, is there someone more junior on your team who could come present? I was brought into the boardroom at a very early age, and I am forever grateful for that because it demystified it for me early on in my career. But on the flip side, that's not always possible. But what is possible is to ask those questions. What happened at the board meeting that you didn't go to, and to start to show that curiosity so that the space is a little more demystified for you. Well, we have time for one last question. I'm going to do kind of a rapid answer. As you think of the most valuable characteristics of a great board member, and maybe this is someone you've gotten the opportunity to work with, what would be that characteristic? Michele?
When I think of my mentor who was on my board at OpenDNS, I really look at his qualities. It's I think he brought empathy to the table, even though he had never been an operator. But he, spent more time listening and asking questions. And when I would go to him about issues that I had to deal with, he didn't pretend to have the answer. He never gave me the answer. But what he did was he either connected me to someone who could give me more perspective, or he helped me think through the things I was struggling with. And I really look at, those qualities as really important as a board director, and I try and emulate them in my role as a board director, really around being a partner to the CEO or the operating executives at the company, and really being a partner in their thought process and not taking my operating experience and telling them what to do, but really serving as sort of that sounding board, empathetic sounding board, but also helping them to get to a decision and an optimal, path forward.
Great, thank you. Anne, how about you?
I would say, integrity of conviction. I love at the board meetings when we ask, what's the right thing to do here? I think that's a really important thing, and I really value other board members who challenge and make sure that we are, following a true north. What is right? What's the integrity to do? It will work out great for shareholders and stockholders.
Awesome. Well, I just want to say a big, big, big thank you to WTF for hosting this session, for dedicating a full hour. I also want to thank the over 100 attendees who took an hour out of their day to listen to this. But most importantly, I really want to thank you, Anne and Michele, for taking your time to share your stories, to share your wisdom, which is one of the best ways that we can all learn. So I really appreciate that. So just a couple of things for the audience. If you are ready to step on a board today, please let Elena know. And she'll connect you to the Hemp for Her organization, and we can onboard you into our network, which helps with your own visibility for open seats and other events. And then she'll also help you assess that kind of question around readiness. If you're thinking about being board ready in the next 2 to 5 years, there's been some great information shared here about how to continue to pave that pathway. There's also some organizations that are around and available to help. There's Athena Alliance, there's 2020 Women on Boards, there's Boardbound. There's many other great organizations that were mentioned today, and we're thankful to all those organizations who all have a shared vision of getting more of this audience into the boardroom. And with that, I will turn it back to Nadia to close us out.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. Jocelyn, Ann, and Michelle, thank you so much for just sharing your experiences and all of this advice. It was also great just seeing the chat and that everyone was, leaving comments, great questions from the audience. So really appreciate the transparency here. Also tremendously grateful for the great work that Him for Her is doing to help bridge the gap responsible for the sparsity of women in the boardroom. And we encourage everyone in the audience to check Him for Her out at himforher.org. Today's masterclass has been recorded, and we'll be emailing a link later today to check that out. We'll also be posting it on our website at womenstechforum.com, and we encourage you to share or follow us on LinkedIn, where you can stay up to date there as well. I'd also like to thank all of our WTF fam, aka all of you out there in the audience. Thanks so much for joining us to kick off our 2021 Masterclass series. We were actually able to gather some really helpful feedback in an end-of-year survey. So keep an eye out for some really exciting things that'll be coming down the pipeline later this year, including some topics that all of you have expressed interest in. So really excited. Stay tuned for more to come, and just want to again thank everyone for joining us. So take care. Bye, everyone.